Silence. Then something curious happened. Regan's breath turned suddenly foul. It was thick, like a current. The psychiatrist smelled it from 2 feet away. He shone the penlight on Regan's face and, wide-eyed and shocked, Chris lifted a hand to stifle a gasp as she watched Regan's features contort into a malevolent mask, her lips pulling tautly in opposite directions, and a tummified tongue lolling wolfishly from her mouth. "Are you the person in Regan?" asked the psychiatrist. Regan nodded. "Who are you?" "No on my," she answered gutturally. "That's your name." Another nod. "You're a man?" she said. "Say." "Did you answer?" "Say." "If that's yes, nod your head." Regan nodded. "Are you speaking in a foreign language?" "Say." "Where do you come from?" "Dog." "You say that you come from a dog?" "Dog morph motion," Regan replied. The psychiatrist paused, and after thinking it over he decided to attempt another approach. "When I ask you questions now, you will answer by moving your head. A nod for yes, and a shake for no. Do you understand that?" Regan nodded. "Did your answers have meaning?" he asked her. "Yes." "Are you someone whom Regan has known?" "No." "That she knows of?" "No." "Are you someone she's invented?" "No." "You're real?" "Yes." "Part of Regan?" "No." "Were you ever a part of Regan?" "No." "Do you like her?" "No." "Dislike her?" "Yes." "Do you hate her?" "Yes." "Over something she's done?" "Yes." "Do you blame her for her parents' divorce?" "No." "Has it something to do with her parents?" "No." "With a friend?" "No." "But you hate her?" "Yes." "Are you punishing Regan?" "Yes." "You wish to harm her?" "Yes." "To kill her?" "Yes." "If she died, wouldn't you die too?" "No." The answer seemed to disquiet him and he lowered his eyes in thought. The bed springs squeaked as he shifted his weight. In the smothering stillness, Regan's breathing came raspy as if from a rotted, putrid bellows. Here. Yet far. And sinister. As he lifted his glance again to that hideous, twisted face, the psychiatrist's eyes gleamed sharply with speculation as he asked, "Is there something she can do that would make you leave her?" "Yes." "Can you tell me what it is?" "Yes." "Will you tell me?" "No." "But." Abruptly the psychiatrist gasped in pain as he realized with horrified incredulity that Regan was squeezing his scrotum with a hand that had gripped him like an iron talon. Eyes wide and staring, he struggled to free himself, but he couldn't. Sam, help me," he croaked in agony. Bedlam. Chris leaping for the light switch. Dr. Klein running forward. Regan with her head back, cackling demonically, then howling like a wolf. Chris slapped at the light switch, then she turned and saw flickering, grainy black and white film of a slow-motion nightmare. Regan and the doctors writhing on the bed in a tangle of shifting arms and legs, in a melee of grimaces, gasps and curses, and the howling and the yelping and that hideous laughter. Regan oinking and grunting like a pig, Regan neighing like a horse, and then the film racing faster with the bedstead shaking and violently quivering from side to side as Regan's eyes rolled upward into their sockets and she wrenched up a keening shriek of terror torn raw and bloody from the base of her spine. Regan crumpled and fell unconscious. Something unspeakable left the room. For a haunted space of time, no one moved. Then slowly and carefully, the doctors untangled themselves. They stood up and stared at Regan, speechless, and then Klein, expressionless, moved to the bed, took Regan's pulse and, satisfied, slowly and gently pulled her blanket up over her, and then nodded to Chris and the psychiatrist. They left the room and went down to the study, where, for a time, no one spoke. Chris was on the sofa, with Klein and the psychiatrist near her in the facing chairs that bracketed the space. The psychiatrist was pensive, pinching at his lip as he stared at the coffee table dully, then finally sighed and looked up at Chris as she turned her burned-out gaze to his. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, in a haggard, vanquished whisper. "Did you recognize the language she was speaking?" Chris shook her head. "Have you any religious beliefs?" "No, I don't." "And your daughter?" "No." From there the psychiatrist asked a lengthy series of questions relating to Regan's psychological history, and when at last he had finished, he seemed disturbed. "What is it?" Chris asked him, her white-knuckled fingers clenching and unclenching on the balled-up handkerchief in her fist. "Doc, what has she got?" The psychiatrist looked evasive. "Well, it's somewhat confusing," he said. And quite frankly, it would be quite irresponsible for me to attempt a diagnosis after so brief an examination. Well, you must have some idea, Chris insisted. Fingering his brow and looking down, the psychiatrist emitted a sigh, then, relenting, looked up and said, "All right. I know you're quite anxious, so I'll mention a couple of impressions. But they're tentative, okay?" Chris leaned forward, nodding tensely. "Yeah, okay. So what are they?" Fingers in her lap started fumbling with the handkerchief, telling stitches in the hem like linen rosary beads. To begin with, the psychiatrist told her, it's highly improbable that she's faking. "Right, Sam." Klein was nodding in agreement. "We think so for a number of reasons," the psychiatrist continued. "For example, the abnormal and painful contortions, and most dramatically, I suppose, from the change in her features when we were talking to the so-called person she thinks is inside her. A psychic effect like that is unlikely unless she believed in this person. Do you follow?" "Yeah, I guess," Chris answered. "Except one thing I don't understand is where this other person comes from. I mean, you keep hearing about split personality, but I've never really known any explanation." "Well, neither does anyone else. We use concepts like consciousness, mind, personality, but we don't really know yet what they are. So when I start talking about something like multiple or split personality, all we have are some theories that raise more questions than they give answers." Freud thought that certain ideas and feelings are somehow repressed by the conscious mind, but remain alive in a person's subconscious, remain quite strong, in fact, and continue to seek expression through various psychiatric symptoms. Now when this repressed, or let's call it dissociated material, the word dissociation implying a splitting off from the mainstream of consciousness. Are you with me? Yeah, go on. All right. Well, when this type of material is sufficiently strong, or where the subject's personality is disorganized and weak, the result can be schizophrenic psychosis. Now that isn't the same, he cautioned, as dual personality. Schizophrenia means a shattering of the personality. But where the dissociated material is strong enough to somehow come glued together, to somehow organize in the individual's subconscious, why, then it's been known, at times, to function independently as a separate personality. In other words, to take over the bodily functions. And that's what you think is happening to Regan. Well, that's just one theory. There are several others. Some of them involving the notion of escape into unawareness. Escape from some conflict or emotional problem. Your daughter hasn't any history of schizophrenia and the EEG didn't show the brainwave pattern that normally accompanies it. So that leaves us with the general field of hysteria. I gave last week, Chris murmured. The worried psychiatrist smiled thinly. Hysteria, he continued, is a form of neurosis in which emotional disturbances are converted into bodily disorders. Now, in certain of its forms, there's dissociation. In psychasthenia, for example, the individual loses consciousness of his actions, but he sees himself act and attributes his actions to someone else. His idea of the second personality is vague, however, and Regan's seems specific. So we come to what Freud used to call the conversion form of hysteria, which grows from unconscious feelings of guilt and the need to be punished. Dissociation is the paramount feature here, even multiple personality. And the syndrome might also include epileptoid-like convulsions, hallucinations and abnormal motor excitement. Chris had listened intently, her eyes and face scrunched up with the strain of trying to understand. Well, that does sound a lot like Regan, she said. Don't you think? Well, except for the guilt part. I mean, what would she have to feel guilty about? Well, a cliché answer might be the divorce. Children often feel that they are the ones rejected and sometimes assume the full responsibility for the departure of one of their parents, so in the case of your daughter, that might apply. Here I'm thinking of the symptoms of thanatophobia, a brooding and neurotic depression over the notion of people dying. Chris's stare grew intense. In children, the psychiatrist continued, you'll find it accompanied by guilt formation that's related to family stress, very often the fear of the loss of a parent. It produces rage and intense frustration. In addition, the guilt in this type of hysteria needn't be known to the conscious mind. It could even be the guilt that we call free-floating, which means it relates to nothing in particular. So this fear of death thing. The thanatophobia. Yeah, right, what you said. Is it something that's inherited? Looking slightly aside to avoid betraying his curiosity about the question, the psychiatrist said, No, I don't think so. Chris lowered her head and shook it. I just don't get it, she said, I'm confused. She looked up, gentle furrows lightly lining her brow. I mean, where does this new personality come in? The psychiatrist turned back to her. Well, again, it's just a guess, he said. But assuming that it is conversion hysteria stemming from guilt, then the second personality is simply the agent who handles the punishing. If Regan herself were to do it, that would mean she would recognize her guilt. But she wants to escape that recognition. Therefore, a second personality. And that's it? That's what you think she's got? As I said, I don't know. The psychiatrist seemed to be choosing his words as carefully as flat, round stones to skim over a pond. It's fairly extraordinary for a child of her age to be able to pull together and organize the components of a new personality. And well, there are some other things that are puzzling. Her performance with the Ouija board, for example, would indicate extreme suggestibility, and yet apparently I never really hypnotized her. He shrugged. Maybe she resisted. But the really striking thing, he noted, is the new personality's apparent precocity. It isn't a 12-year-old at all. It's much older. And then there's the language she was speaking. His voice trailed off, as he stared into the fireplace pensively. There's a similar state, of course, he said, but we don't know very much about it. What is it? The psychiatrist turned to her. Well, it's a form of somnambulism where the subject suddenly manifests knowledge or skills that he's never learned, and where the intention of the second personality is to, he broke off. Well, it's terribly complicated, he resumed, and I've oversimplified outrageously. He had also not completed his statement, for fear of unduly upsetting Chris. The intention of the second personality, he would have said, was the destruction of the first. And so what's the bottom line? A bit squiggly. She needs an intensive examination by a team of specialists. 2 or 3 weeks of really concentrated study in a clinical atmosphere. Someplace like the Barringer Clinic in Dayton. Chris turned away, looking down. It's a problem? The psychiatrist asked her. She shook her head and said softly and morosely, no, I just lost hope, that's all. I didn't get you. Long story. The psychiatrist telephoned the Barringer Clinic. They agreed to take Regan the following day. The doctors left. Chris swallowed the ache of remembrance of Dennings, thought again about death and the worm and the void and the unspeakable loneliness, the stillness and the silence and the darkness that awaited beneath the sod. No movement, no breathing, nothing. Too much. Chris lowered her head and briefly wept. And then put it away. Packing for the trip, Chris was standing in her bedroom selecting a camouflaging wig to wear in Dayton when Carl appeared at the open door. There was someone to see her, he told her. Who? Detective. Detective? And he wants to see me? Yes, madam.